The deal was made in silence. A few coins passed from one calloused hand to another. A drunken nod sealed it. Nothing more. No contract, no eye contact, no blessing. Thomas didn't ask the girl her name. She didn't offer one. She stood in the mud just outside the sheriff's office, wearing a threadbare dress and a man's coat far too large for her. Her hair covered most of her face, tangled and matted like old yarn. She didn't look up, not even once. The sheriff scratched his head awkwardly. She don't talk. Folks think she's deaf. Hasn't said a word since her old man started drinking hard. He lowered his voice. Frankly, you're doing her a mercy. Thomas gave a slow nod. Not in agreement, just acceptance. He didn't need more noise on his ranch, or more people. But something in her, something in the way she didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't beg, felt familiar, like she was already halfway ghost. They rode in silence. She sat behind him on the mule cart, hands clasped around her knees. Every time the wheels hit a rut, she tensed, but made no sound. Not a grunt, not a breath. Nothing. By the time the ranch came into view, dusk had settled into the folds of the hills. The wind brushed over the prairie in hushes and shivers, as if nature itself were whispering secrets. He helped her down. She avoided his hand. Room's in the loft, he said, voice rough from disuse. There's a stove, water pump out back. I won't bother you. She didn't nod, didn't blink, just turned toward the barn with her head down, and Thomas, watching her go, felt something stir in his chest. Something like guilt, or recognition, or maybe just the echo of a time long buried. He'd taken her in for one reason only, because she had no one. But in the hollow quiet she left behind, he wondered. Had he just brought home someone even lonelier than himself? The mornings on the ranch came soft and gray. Thomas rose with the cold. Always had. Years alone had made the silence comfortable, almost sacred. No voices, no demands. Just the creak of the stove, the whisper of coffee on the boil, the hollow echo of boots across the pine floor. This morning was no different, at least not at first. He didn't expect to see her, not so early. But as he stepped into the kitchen, he saw the edge of her coat vanishing around the back door. Bare feet, silent as smoke. He paused, hand resting on the stove handle. She hadn't noticed him. She moved through the yard like a shadow, cautious, weightless, like the land might give way if she stepped too hard. She crouched by the pump, hands fumbling with the iron handle. A few pumps, then water gushed into the tin bucket. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just waited until it filled, then carried it back with both hands, arms trembling slightly under the weight. He watched all of this through the warped glass pane of the window, unseen. Every movement she made was careful, measured, as if she'd been punished before for getting it wrong. Back inside, she passed by him with the bucket without a glance. She must have heard the creak of the floor beneath him. It always creaked in that spot, but she didn't look up. Her shoulders tensed, just a flicker, and she kept walking. He realized then, she wasn't deaf, not completely. She had heard him, not with certainty, not like someone used to sound, but like a wild animal, always alert to what might come. And that made his chest ache. He didn't speak. He didn't want to startle her. Instead, he stepped aside to let her pass, and gently, almost without sound, he reached for the door behind her and held it open. She froze at the threshold, just for a moment, then stepped through. And as she did, he noticed her breath, the barest shift in her ribcage, like she'd braced for something that didn't come, like she was waiting for the noise that always followed men. But it never came, not from him, only quiet. The barn had its own kind of hush. Dust floated like soft breath through the golden light. Horses shifted gently in their stalls, tails flicking. The smell of hay, leather, and earth filled the space. Clean, honest smells. She stood in the corner, just out of sight, watching. Thomas knew she was there, even if she didn't mean to be seen. She lingered like wind behind a curtain, present but untouchable. He didn't call to her, didn't beckon, didn't ask questions. He just kept brushing the mare, long, slow strokes along the grain of her back. The girl watched his hands, His hands were thick and scarred from decades of hard work, but gentle, steady, the kind that didn't flinch, the kind that didn't strike. They moved with a rhythm, a silence that said more than voices ever could. Without a word, he reached for another brush and, without turning around, set it on the edge of the stall. Then he stepped away. She didn't move at first, just stared at it like it might bite her. But he said nothing, just walked across the barn and began feeding the chickens in the corner, his back turned, as if her choice didn't matter to him one way or the other. Stillness stretched thin between them. Then, the softest shuffle. She approached. He didn't look, but he heard the rhythm shift. A second set of bristles moving across the mare's coat, uneven, cautious. The brushing wasn't strong. Her hand trembled, but she did it, slowly, carefully. A flicker of life entered her eyes. Not joy, exactly, but something close. The mare leaned into her touch, and for the first time since she'd come to the ranch, the girl breathed like she belonged to her own body. He didn't interrupt, didn't praise, just let it be. Later that day, she found a small slate board on the table in the kitchen, along with a stick of chalk. Nothing fancy, but beside it, in blocky, deliberate writing, he'd scratched 3 words. If you want. Not a question, not a command, just an offering. She stood over it for a long time. Her fingers brushed the chalk, but she didn't write anything. Not yet. But the tiniest shift had begun, and Thomas, sitting outside on the porch, heard the screen door click shut behind her and allowed himself the smallest of thoughts. Maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she'd just never been invited to speak. A week passed. Not a word spoken between them. Not aloud. But the silence no longer echoed. It settled, soft and lived in, like dust on old shelves finally left undisturbed. He never asked where she went when she wandered past the corral, down the sloping ridge where the grass grew long and wild. She'd sit there for hours, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to wind and watching the sky. But she always came back before dark. He began to notice patterns. She moved like she belonged to the land. Barefoot, light, alert. She flinched at metal sounds. The clang of a gate, the hammer on fence posts. But wind didn't bother her, nor birdsong, nor the thrum of hooves when the horses ran. And when he moved, only him, she listened. He tested it once, accidentally. He was coming up behind her in the field, boots slow in the dry grass. She didn't turn. But when he coughed, a quiet sound, throat clearing, she stiffened. Her fingers closed into fists at her sides. Then slowly she turned to face him, eyes wide, startled, breathing thin. He lifted his hands. Didn't mean to scare you. No answer. But her shoulders eased, just barely. He paused, then gently with no pressure. Can you hear me? She didn't move. He stepped forward just once, slow and careful. Then crouched, picked up a sprig of sagebrush from the ground, and held it out to her. She hesitated, then took it. Their fingers didn't touch. But for the first time, she looked at him fully, not just from the corner of her eye. He saw it then, clear as the morning light. She was afraid of voices, but not of him, not anymore. That evening, he found the slate board moved from the table. It sat on the porch rail, chalk resting next to it. One word written in small, hesitant letters. Sometimes. He stared at it for a long while. Then, without a sound, he sat in the chair beside it, not facing the door, not trying to find her, just waiting. And as the sky dimmed and the coyotes howled in the far distance, he realized the ranch wasn't quiet anymore. It was listening. The wind had picked up by morning. It came down off the ridge like a living thing, dragging dry leaves across the porch, rattling the loose shutter beside the window. Inside the house, every sound carried louder than it should have. Thomas was in the barn hauling feed. He hadn't noticed the door had swung open behind him, just enough to catch, then slam with a loud, sudden crack. The sound tore through the air like a gunshot, and it tore her too. She'd been in the corner of the tack room, hands buried in the old fleece blankets he'd let her wash. She didn't scream. She never did. But her whole body folded in on itself, like paper caught in rain. He found her crouched beneath the work table, curled, silent, breath too fast, knuckles white against her knees. He didn't speak, didn't call her name, not that she'd told him one. Instead, he knelt down slowly beside the table. Not close, not touching, just low, grounded, his boots planted, palms resting face up on his knees. And then he waited. A full minute passed, then another. He counted the rise of her shoulders, fast, uneven, then slowly settling. When her hands finally loosened, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of cloth, a handkerchief. Nothing special, old, clean, worn. The days grew longer, not by much, just enough that the shadows didn't fall so early, and the light lingered on the fence posts like it too was learning to stay. She moved differently now, still quiet, still watchful, but the tightness in her shoulders had begun to ease. She no longer flinched at every gust of wind. She no longer waited at the edges of the room. Sometimes she even entered before him. Thomas noticed without comment. He simply made space. He laid out extra hay for the goats. She'd started feeding them, slipping bits of carrot from her pocket, her fingers slow and open. He started leaving the kitchen door cracked just enough that she could choose whether or not to come in. More often than not, she did. And every few days, the slate board would move. It would appear on the windowsill, on the porch step. Once beside the wash basin with just one word scrawled in faint chalk. Fire. He hadn't understood it at first. Thought maybe it was fear, a memory, a warning. But when he stepped outside that night, he found her sitting near the barn, wrapped in an old blanket, watching the coals in the fire pit pulse red like a heartbeat. She didn't move when he approached. He sat a few feet away, didn't speak, just fed the fire. And that was the night he realized. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. He started writing back, on the slate beside her words or in small notes he left under her cup. Mare foaled this morning. Storm coming. You did good with the calf. She'd respond with nods, or silence, or a single word. But it was conversation, a kind of language all their own. One morning he found the board left on the kitchen table, cleaned off, blank, except for two words written carefully, slowly. Your voice. That's all it said. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but something about it stayed with him, like a bell rung at a distance, faint but unforgettable. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she curled on the edge of the chair, arms tucked to her chest, and he said quietly, I used to talk a lot. She turned her head, just slightly. He didn't look at her, just stared at the flames, voice low, before everything went quiet. The logs crackled, wind moved outside. He didn't explain what everything meant, didn't need to. He just said softer, I forgot how to say things that matter. Then he added after a breath, but I think you hear what counts anyway. He glanced sideways. She was watching him, still and wide-eyed. And then, gently, like a match struck against stone, she wrote something on the slate resting in her lap. She turned it toward him. I do. The morning light spilled softly over the ridge, painting everything gold. Thomas stood on the porch, watching the horizon stretch wide and empty before him. The wind moved slow, carrying scents of sage and dry grass, the pulse of the land itself. She came out from the house without a word, hands tucked deep in her sleeves. For a moment they simply stood side by side, two shapes outlined against the vast prairie. He didn't reach for her, didn't speak. Instead, he pointed to the saddle resting against the porch post, a question without words. She looked at it, then back to him. Slowly, carefully, she nodded. The old horse waited patiently in the corral, eyes soft and steady. Thomas led her forward, hand firm on the reins but gentle. She climbed up onto the saddle, trembling. Her hands gripped the reins with a nervous strength, white knuckles, yet steady. Thomas mounted behind her, close but not touching, giving her space to find her balance. The world stretched open beneath them, wide and endless. The horse's hooves thudded against the earth. A steady rhythm, a quiet music. Her breath came steady now. Then without looking back, she turned her head just slightly. Her eyes met his for a brief moment. In that glance, he saw everything she hadn't said. Fear, hope, trust, and something like peace. The wind caught at her hair, and for the first time Thomas heard it clearly. Not silence, but the beginning of sound. The sun was low, slipping behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the ranch. Inside the small kitchen, the firelight flickered against rough wooden walls. She sat by the window, the slate board resting on her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the fading light outside, fingers tracing invisible patterns over the chalk. Thomas stood nearby, folding a threadbare blanket. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It felt more like a pause, a breath waiting to be taken. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her. At last he cleared his throat. "Do you want to try?" he said softly, holding out his hand. She looked at him, really looked, as if seeing him for the first time. Then with a hesitant breath, she nodded. He handed her the slate. For a long moment, her hand hovered, unsure. Then slowly she began to write. The letters were shaky but deliberate. "I hear you." Thomas's chest tightened. He knelt beside her, his voice low and gentle. "I hear you too." Her lips parted slightly and then a whisper escaped. "Thank you." The words trembled in the quiet room, fragile and new, like the first bloom after a long winter. They sat together, the fire crackling softly, and in that shared silence, everything changed. For the first time, the space between them wasn't empty. It was filled with possibility. The morning dawned cool and clear, the sky brushed pale blue and streaked with soft pink. Thomas was already outside tending the fence, his movements slow and deliberate, the familiar rhythm a balm to his restless mind. Inside the house, she sat by the kitchen table, slate board resting on its worn surface. Her eyes flickered toward the door every so often, as if waiting for something or someone. When Thomas stepped inside, the floorboards creaked softly beneath his boots. She didn't startle. Instead, she lifted the board and wrote, "Morning." He smiled, a slow, rare curve of his lips. "Morning," he replied, pulling out a piece of scrap paper and a stub of pencil from his pocket. He scribbled, "How are you today?" She studied it carefully, then her chalk moved in neat, deliberate strokes. "Better, because of you." He felt the weight of those words settle in the room, more tangible than any spoken vow. He folded the paper, set it before her. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass. Neither spoke more that morning, but between them something had shifted. The quiet was no longer absence. It was presence, and it was enough. Evening settled over the ranch like a soft, dark blanket. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the worn walls. She sat close, wrapped in the heavy blanket Thomas had brought her. The slate board rested forgotten on the table. For a long moment, the room held only the sound of the fire and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. Then Thomas reached over, gently picking up her hand. His voice was low, hesitant, as if testing the fragile ground between them. "Mary?" Her eyes met his, steady, curious, and then almost a whisper, but clear as the prairie wind. "Thomas." The single word hung in the air, fragile but full of meaning. He smiled, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. She nodded, lips barely moving. That night, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise of new beginnings. The dawn seeped slowly through the thin curtains, casting soft shadows across the simple room. Thomas was already awake, sitting by the window with a worn journal resting on his knee. She stirred quietly, her eyes adjusting to the pale light. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of his journal. He looked up, meeting her gaze, a silent question passing between them. Carefully, he opened the book to a blank page and drew a rough sketch of the ranch, the house, the barn, the field stretching beyond. He handed the journal to her. Her fingers traced the lines, tentative but curious. Then she took the pencil and added a small figure beside the house. A woman standing beneath a lone tree. Thomas nodded. "This is you," he said softly. She looked away, a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes. He didn't press. Instead, he wrote a single word beneath the drawing. "Home." She smiled faintly, a fragile curve that spoke volumes. In that quiet morning light, they sat together. Two souls slowly weaving a new story, word by word, line by line. The sky darkened in the late afternoon, heavy clouds rolling over the prairie like a gathering tide. A storm was coming. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick with tension. She sat curled in a corner, arms wrapped tight around her knees, eyes fixed on the window where the first drops of rain began to patter. Thomas moved silently, fetching blankets and lighting lanterns. The thunder rumbled low, a distant growl that made her flinch. He knelt beside her, careful not to crowd. Without words, he reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She inhaled sharply, a silent tremor running through her. He didn't speak, just stayed there, steady and patient. When the lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white, she closed her eyes and squeezed her fists. Thomas's voice was soft, a low murmur that didn't demand a response. "We'll get through this." Hours passed. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, two souls found shelter, not just from the rain, but from the echoes of old fears. When dawn finally broke, the world was washed clean. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes no longer clouded with dread, but clear, tentative. For the first time, she reached out and took his hand. No words were needed. The silence said it all. The prairie stretched endless beneath a pale sky, soft grasses swaying in a tender breeze. Thomas and she stood at the edge of the field, the warm afternoon sun casting long shadows. He handed her a worn leather-bound book, a journal filled with his sketches and notes. She opened it slowly, fingers trembling as she traced the faded ink. Without a word, she lifted her eyes to his. He nodded, encouraging but patient. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, she revealed a delicate sketch, a single wildflower, its petals open and fragile. He smiled softly, heart stirred by the silent gift. Together they watched the wind carry the grass, feeling the quiet harmony growing between them. The world was wide and uncertain, but here, in this moment, there was a fragile peace, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something like hope. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of rain and earth. Inside the cabin, the flicker of the lantern threw dancing shadows on the walls. She sat quietly, her fingers tracing the faint scar along her wrist, a silent mark of a past she rarely spoke of. Thomas noticed, his gaze soft but steady. Without a word, he reached for an old worn photo from the mantel, a faded picture of a woman, strong and kind-eyed. He placed it gently before her. Her breath caught. The photo was of her mother. Memories stirred in her eyes, sharp and distant, like a storm on the horizon. She shook her head, unable to speak. Thomas nodded, understanding. He took her hand, his touch gentle, unwavering. "You're safe here," he said softly. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean into the moment. The weight of her silence began to lift. Outside, the prairie whispered with the coming night. Inside, two souls found light in the quiet darkness. The first light of morning spilled gently over the rolling hills, warming the earth and stirring the prairie grasses. Thomas stood at the porch, watching as she stepped out into the fresh air, the soft rustle of her dress blending with the morning breeze. For the first time, her eyes met his without hesitation. No walls, no shadows, just the quiet strength of two souls learning to trust. She lifted her hand slowly, fingers brushing his. A soft smile curved her lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden token, a simple symbol of the ranch, a promise of belonging. She accepted it, holding it close. Then with a breath, she spoke a full sentence, clear, steady, and full of life. "I am here." Thomas's heart swelled with a warmth that had long been dormant. Together they turned toward the open land, their future as wide and uncharted as the prairie itself. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was alive, full of sound, full of hope.